button. It's okay with Jeff. We'll record this also. Okay, welcome everybody to the House Divided Book Study class. This is session 4 on healthcare. And I'm Steve Baska, your Zoom operator. And we are going to be led tonight by Jeff Klaus, who is a class leader of many classes at St. Andrew, and he is an attorney and a world traveler, so he is well positioned to talk on social issues like this. We're going to have a good discussion tonight, and we do recognize that there is some kind of presidential debate going on TV that is pulling people away, but we have our TVs recording it anyway, and we are going to have a good hour and some discussion before we go back and watch that later. So with that, a couple of our regular announcements. Please mute yourself. In the lower left corner of your screen, there's a little icon that says mute on most of our screens. So mute that so we don't hear background noise. We are recording this for future playback for those who missed it tonight live. And please be kind in your comments and brief and speak up loud into your microphone so we can do your computer so we can hear you well. With that, I turn it over to Jeff Klaus.
Well, thanks so much, Steve, and thank you all for letting me be part of this class and facilitate this class in particular. We'll be doing a lot of discussion parts, so when we get to those places, raise either your physical hand, or you can use the reaction prompt and raise a virtual hand, and I'll try to call on people that way and be observing who wants to talk. Please try to give everyone else a chance to talk before you maybe have a second or third comment, but I think with a smallerish group tonight, we all should be able to participate. Just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land on how I thought I would proceed with things tonight would be, I thought we'll start with the axioms that Mark has given us in the book and discuss those first, and discuss those in the context of, do we agree with those? Do we accept those as axioms or disagree with them? Why or why not? And maybe what's our takeaway from that axiom? Then we'll proceed to the video, which I think will further discuss some of the factual background and the axioms. And then finally, we'll do some questions and discuss maybe some more of the details of healthcare. And I'd like to leave the bulk of the time for that. But I'd like us to keep in mind how the axioms, if we accept them, how do those inform our answers to the questions? If we accept these statements as true statements, how does that guide us in our decision-making process, or how we interpret the answers to the questions? Healthcare seems to have so many obvious things about it, like that we're all going to need some level of healthcare at some point in our life, and we probably all agree that it's way too expensive right now in this country. After that, it gets pretty muddled as to what we could agree on. Mark, in his book, has his first axiom is, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. Does anyone have a reaction or a takeaway as to how and why we should adopt that statement as an axiom for our discussion of healthcare? One of my reactions to that, or takeaway, is, the discussion in the book that Jesus was a healer, and most of his healings weren't just, random healings or random miracles. They were all healing people in such a way that returned those people to community and made those people better able to participate and be a part of the community they lived in, and that the community Jesus modeled was a very inclusive community.
Jeff, I would agree with that in that I think most people look at superficially at Jesus' healings thinking it was just compassion to heal the suffering of the moment for somebody. And I think they do miss the bigger picture, what he was getting at by doing that. And that he was trying to help them be fully alive and connected to their community.
I saw a hand up for Lon.
I think it's a good sentiment. I don't believe it goes far enough because we know so many more people today who are more concerned about their horses and their dogs and their cats. And so it includes the natural world. I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Anybody else? I happened to be listening to NPR yesterday, thinking about this class coming today, and they were interviewing a woman about the Supreme Court, potential Supreme Court appointment. And she was expressing her interest as a Christian, that she felt it was very important to have someone that might feel the same way she did about abortion. And that was a very important issue to her as a Christian. And then she said, also as a Christian, she said, well, healthcare isn't too important to me. And so I hope that they will also overturn the ACA. And I thought that was just really a disconnected statement. I don't know what anyone else's reaction to that kind of thinking might be, but let's go ahead and move on to the other axioms. And I think they all have a kind of a similar theme. If you have your book there, you can follow along with me. But the second axiom is, good health is a crown on the head of a well person that only a sick person can see, and illness is a cross borne by the unsuspecting. There's a lot in that statement. Anyone? Yeah, Ron.
I think there's kind of a corollary there to me, where it would be good health care is a crown on the head of a well person and only a sick person can see. That's coming from personal experience. I was a UPS driver for 33 years, and as a union company, we had like the gold Cadillac of healthcare. I raised 3 kids on it and everything else. We had a $10 copay for emergency rooms, no copays for anything else except for orthodontic care. I mean, full dental, full vision care, full everything, no copays, and I paid absolutely zero for my healthcare coverage. It was all company paid for, as the pension. So to me, when I actually went on to Medicare and I had picked up a prescription, had to pay a copay, I was like, what, we pay copays? So it's something I think people with really good healthcare simply don't realize what it is and how important it is, and that many people don't have it.
Any other comments? Anyone sort of disagree with that as an axiom? My takeaway of that axiom is just basically, don't take good health or good health care for granted. And that's easy to do for all of us that have it. Ron?
I would add to what Ron has said. There have been many meetings in Washington, D.C., organized around healthcare. And for a good 40 years or more, the people who were invited to the meetings were General Motors, General Electric, the large corporations. The individuals did not have representation. So there's a blind spot in our, just as Ron was saying, there's a blind spot in America about healthcare, because it's either provided or it's not.
Yeah.
It's either you don't know it's what the cost is, or it's unaffordable.
Janet?
Yeah, I can talk about somebody who did not have good health care as kind of a corollary, perhaps. My sister was self-employed, and so she bought her own health care. And when she got breast cancer, her health care company told her that she was not covered for cancer. And so for the 4 years that I took care of her, she lived in Albuquerque, and I'd go down and spend most of the week and come back. She never let me look at her contract. She just said that the insurance company had told her no. So instead of being able to get any kind of cutting edge healthcare as Ron might have been able to do, she had to get whatever her doctor could find that was free or low cost, or if she could be on some sort of one of the tests that they were doing over the whole time. So she did not get the very best healthcare available. She died in 2004, partly because she couldn't get the kind of healthcare she needed. And she died in the summer. That fall, there was a thing on Channel 7 News about a couple who had to get healthcare the same way that my sister did. And they knew that they were going to have a difficult pregnancy. And so they specifically asked, were difficult pregnancies covered? And the insurance company assured them that yes, it was. So they bought the insurance. And then when they had a difficult pregnancy, the insurance company said, oh, no, you're not covered for difficult pregnancies. They went to Channel 7 for one of those investigative reporters. And the reason it stuck with me is that that was the same insurance company that had told my sister that she did not have coverage for cancer. So I was still cleaning up her estate. I found the contract. I looked it over. My sister was in fact covered for cancer, but they never covered her.
Oh, that's sad. Anyone else have a example or a comment on that? In my early practice, I did a lot of debtor and creditor work, including representing individuals in bankruptcy cases. And it was very apparent even in those days, and I think it's much worse now, that uncovered healthcare costs for an unexpected medical procedure or an illness cause a high percentage of the number of individual bankruptcies in this country. And I think that creates a huge economic disruption, because once the people that were otherwise paying mortgages and car loans and all of the other bills that they had to pay, puts all of those other things in jeopardy and makes a big economic impact on their ability to do all those other day-to-day activities. As well as having...
On the financial part of that, I had to get a lawyer who had to get even though Kathy was self-paying what she could, I had to get a lawyer to help me solve her medical bills for pennies on the dollar, because she had virtually her entire estate went to pay, and even then I couldn't pay everything she owed to the medical providers.
That's actually another little dirty little secret, I think, that you probably exposed when you went and were doing that, is insurance companies have kind of a two-tiered pricing. You know, they have the pricing that they'll put on a bill for an uninsured person, but the amount that they actually get paid by insurance is a whole different pricing system. And those things, those numbers are way different. The third axiom in the book is your body is a temple where the Holy Spirit lives. And, you know, I'm reminded that we're discussing this topic in this book, not only because we're, you know, concerned citizens and worried about economic and medical issues, but we're coming at it from a perspective of faith, and we're trying to see how these axioms, um, bring our religious faith and faith in Jesus' teachings and lifestyle to bear on these issues. Any takeaway or comment on that axiom?
I'll open.
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm learning from people I know that there's merit in Chinese medicine, in Indian Ayurvedic medicine, and in naturopath medicine. When the medicine is well-founded and not by someone who is just like the insurance company, pocketing the money and really doesn't do anything. And I'm afraid we all know cases of the insurance companies. They have like boiler rooms to turn away people who wish to file claims. And so they always answer no. And they answer no until a certain number of calls. But these other forms of medicine bring up the healing powers of our Savior. And I think they come from a place of higher learning. They're gifts. And we don't turn down gifts. Okay?
No, and I think that's a great point, because the healthcare system isn't just one monolithic thing. It should be flexible enough to allow us to take advantage of all the opportunities we have for healing. Janet, did you want to say something? Janet Williams? Oh.
Well, my husband's not going to speak up, so I'm going to speak up for him. He and I ran a nonprofit medical clinic in Five Points for over 20 years. And we were primarily serving uninsured and low-income patients. And so and it's still in existence. We've retired, but the clinic is still there, and they're seeing over 2,000 patients a month. And it's called Inner City Health Center. It's a 501c3 independent nonprofit. And one of the things that we found, we have multiple stories, just like Jana was telling. And, we found wonderful, wonderful people that were very hardworking and just simply could not afford insurance. And even though they may have had full-time jobs and just couldn't afford to pay for insurance because it is so expensive. But the other thing that we found, we had many volunteer docs. Bob volunteered all of his time, and we had many volunteer professionals. And one of the things that we found was that, now the medical community, they order all these tests to try to diagnose, and the test costs a lot of money, and the clinic couldn't afford for all these tests to be run because the patient couldn't pay for it and the clinic couldn't pay for it. And so Bob kind of had to teach doctors that you could do a lot of diagnosing without having to run all those tests. So many of them learned how to kind of do old-fashioned medicine. So Bob, you want to add something to this?
Right here. You were still muted, Bob. I don't know if you want to unmute and add to that.
Yeah, here we go. Okay. Well, we'll add more to that when we get to the discussion end of things, once you get through with the axioms.
Okay.
But yeah, a lot of medicine can be done with a physician with good skills rather than depending on so many tests that just run the bills up.
Yeah, we may want your input on some of the issues of why healthcare is so costly in this country in particular. Though I'll toss out the last axiom, which is the price
Jeff,
of
Jeff, could I comment on the third axiom? I wonder what it would mean for us to take that principle seriously, that our bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit. What would that mean about how we care for or don't care for our bodies? And as people of faith who are encouraged, mandated to care for other people in the same way we care for ourselves, what would the implication be for us to see the other person's body, self, as a temple of the Holy Spirit? Would that make any difference in how we care for ourselves or care for others? I sort of think it would.
Good.
Yeah, I would be very inclined to just agree with that. And I think that good health is an end of it itself. But I think that dovetails to the fourth axiom here, because you're talking about the implication of how we go about achieving good health in a community situation, or in a situation where we're not the sole person just worried about our own health care. But the Mark has a quote in there that our price of democracy is our mutual commitment to our common life. And I think that's can be kind of a loaded question, or a loaded axiom, actually. Go ahead, Charlotte, do you have something?
I would agree that this is an axiom that people of faith believe that, Jesus is sending us in that direction. But I mean, it's obvious with the conversations that are going on in America today that there are a whole lot of people who do not agree with this axiom. They do not feel that commitment, and they consider themselves religious people. So I don't know. It's hard for me to say that we can accept that as a fact.
And maybe another way to put that issue is this axiom at odds with a lot of people's sincere and deeply held belief about what the proper role of government is in our community?
The Constitution says the proper role of government is to promote the general welfare in the preamble, or the common well-being, or as Mark has referred to it so eloquently and so often, to care for the common good. And that's more than just what's good for me. He refers to it elsewhere in the chapter, I think, on the need to make sacrifices for other people. That's part of being a whole human being. And it goes back to Jeff's opening comment about the interview you heard on NPR. The woman saying, well, I don't care much about healthcare, so I want the Affordable Care Act to be abolished. Well, the Affordable Care Act makes a difference in the lives of at least 20 million people, and more millions than that if the pre-existing condition coverage is taken away. So what does it mean as an American citizen, not even a person of faith, as an American citizen, to fulfill the goal in the Constitution to promote the general welfare or the common good?
Jeff, your lawyer experience comes in. I have none, but I do read. And there was a very pivotal case, Georgia, state of Georgia, and some insurance company, I forget which one. But this was the case that makes where the Supreme Court decided, like back around 1949 or 50, that the insurance commissions of the individual states would have sovereignty over the insurance plans and insurance companies operating in the states. And you may know the case. But the Affordable Care Act was never fully implemented because one of the votes was to allow groups of individuals, professionals, and others to form groups just the way that United Parcel Service had groups that were covered by the unions. But individuals can't do that. They could do that if that was, so there was a vote. And this was after the Affordable Care Act. And it was in that first 2 years, I believe. And the vote came down 49-51 in the Senate or something like that. It didn't pass. The reason that we don't have, like that case, or as I described in what I sent to you about pre-existing conditions, these are such important political fundraising tools that the politicians and the PACs that support the politicians have a bigger voice than we do. And
I'm not familiar with that case in particular, but I am familiar with those concepts. And, you know, that is always a rub in our system, that we have a conflict between what is a state's right and what should be handled at the federal government. And when you have a national issue like healthcare that crosses all the borders and deals with all the people, it's kind of cumbersome and awkward to have 50 different programs. Let's save further comment on that as we get into the rest of the discussion. I'd like for Steve to go ahead and put the video right now, and let's watch that.
Okay, we are ready to do that. Give me just a second here. And got to push the right buttons here so we can get it all going. Okay. Everybody see that on the screen?
I can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Here we go.
Be my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. Give me doubt.
In the 1970s, researchers discovered a massive aspen grove in Utah's Fish Lake National Forest. It's since been named Pando, which is Latin for I spread. Pando is believed to be the largest, most dense organism ever discovered. It spreads over 106 acres, consisting of over 47,000 individual trees. It's estimated to date back to the end of the last ice age, more than 80,000 years ago. Some of Pando's trees are more than 130 years old. Aspen groves like Pando hold the secret of kinship, kenosis, and delight. Above ground, aspen grow as individual trees, but below ground, they're enlivened by one interconnected set of roots. Such kinship means that they are one living organism and one living community simultaneously. What happens to one aspen happens to all the aspens in the grove. As one living root system, the aspen grove delights in each of its trees, treating each individual as a cherished part of a larger body. These individual parts, or shoots, are called ramets. When an individual tree dies, it's as if the grove loses an entire member of the body. The coronavirus pandemic has pushed hospitals and healthcare workers to the very edge. Today, doctors and nurses are risking their very lives to fight the virus amid a shortage of open beds, ventilators and protective equipment, proven therapeutics. An estimated 27 million Americans have lost employer-based healthcare coverage in the economic shutdown. COVID-19 has hit vulnerable populations, especially the poor and people of color, disproportionately in both infection and mortality rates. As I speak, more than 180,000 Americans have perished from the virus. Many thousands more will die before a vaccine is even available. Thousands of those who have been or will be infected, if they survive, will be faced with unpayable bills and long-term health consequences. The pandemic has laid bare the cracks in the U.S. healthcare system, underscoring the reality that the healthcare industry on whole is torn between generating profit and promoting health. It has never been designed to reconcile those two, especially in a pandemic. Yet it's never been more costly. Today, healthcare accounts for about 18% of gross domestic product, nearly $11,000 per person. In 2019, employer-based insurance plans cost an average of $21,000 for a family policy, or $7,200 for a single person. States' payments for Medicaid have risen to 28.9% of their total state budgets, requiring many states to cut funding for roads, bridges, universities. Today, the U.S. faces a $1 trillion federal deficit caused almost entirely by the rising costs of Medicaid and Medicare. We may disagree on the best solutions to solving the healthcare problem, but as people of faith, can we at least affirm that the glory of God is a human being fully alive, every human being without exception? God cares as much about the health of the body as that of the soul. And according to Jesus, the fate of our souls is determined by how we treat and care for the broken bodies of our neighbors. I was hungry and you fed me, thirsty, you gave me drink, sick and you cared for me, naked and you clothed me. The aspen grove embodies the very spirit of kenosis. When an individual tree dies or develops a disease, the entire grove ushers water and nutrients to the wounded area to begin the work of healing and restoration. The expansive root system depends on the ramets that are closest to a water source to absorb and send the nourishment to the other connected trees. Universal care, concern, and commitment, fueled by creativity and collaboration, such are the keys to the salvation of the aspen grove and to our own. As we address the issue of healthcare, we need the wisdom and compassion of the aspen that can only come from universal concern and a deeper sense of connectedness to one another, and a deeper commitment to the common good. If we can start there, do you think we can find enough common ground to work together for the common good?
Give me doubt so I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, I shall not fear.
I'd like to pick up where we left off with the last axiom in light of kind of where Mark was describing the aspen tree. And I think that's a very apt metaphor for how I believe that we should be viewing each other, that we direct our resources to the ones that are in need and that the strongest help out the weakest. But I'm not convinced that everyone in this country holds that same belief. I think that there is a strong sense of individualism, and that a lot of people would prefer the metaphor maybe of scrub oak trees eking out their separate survival on a harsh planet. And with that in mind, and continuing what we're talking about, how many of you believe that the federal government should guarantee access to affordable health care to all Americans? Why or why not? And how would you promote that to someone who takes that position that, you know, the ACA is just another welfare program disguised as healthcare? Anybody? Lon again?
Jeff, you're going to have to shut me down.
Yeah, no. Hopefully you'll, between the two of us, we'll get some other people to think of something else they want to say as well. So
I was trying to chat to Steve and say, call on me last. I sent to you a little missive about last night.
Oh, okay.
And it pertains to the universal coverage. This was a big subject back in 1970, 72, 70, in the 70s. And Blue Cross Blue Shield top executive over Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana said all the insurance companies were reconciled with it. They could create a pool where 3% of all those cases that needed to change policies or have pre-existing conditions extended would be covered. And it was shut down by Congress. And it was shut down for political reasons, because that was such a good issue that they could campaign on it every time. And so it's a dilemma. It gets back to Washington. The other point with COVID is the FDA has its hands bound by law. You cannot develop a vaccine through normal channels if therapeutics exist to cover that cause people to recover from COVID. So if therapeutics like vitamin D and generic drugs and health and exercise and sunlight and other things, if those therapeutics are saving lives, billions cannot be spent, and the FDA has to approve the therapeutics before they approve the vaccine. It's a dilemma that just causes me to want to cry.
Well, I think a lot of what you're hitting on is, in American, I think we like to pretend, or it's a myth, that we are free enterprise and we have free markets and that there's no corruption. But really, the way our, especially at the federal level, our legislature devises laws and things, it benefits not all of us, but it benefits certain industries, and it's set up in a way not to be the best for us. It's a lot of pork barrel and
Well, and
corn
the lobbyists for the big pharma discovered they only need to buy the chairman.
Right. Anyone else? What does anyone else think about this idea that maybe our government isn't really looking out for us? I think this is a perfect example. I know with one of the laws related to pharmaceuticals that even our federal government isn't allowed to negotiate prices down on prescription drugs when they're the single biggest purchaser and would have the most leverage to get the best price, and they end up paying the highest price.
Jeff, is it possible that today with the technology that exists to get data from around the globe, which we certainly didn't have available in the 70s or 80s, is that a chance that our eyes will be opened and people will begin to fully understand that we don't have by far the best medical system, that we don't treat our people anywhere near as well as those in other countries, and not just other Western or advanced countries are being treated. You know, I wonder today when we see what's happening on the streets with regards to Black Lives Matter and protesters. A lot of that's occurring because of the technology that's available for people to see what is going on. And I wonder if there's a chance that as we approach healthcare, that our visibility of reality may have an impact on our politicians. I don't know.
Dave, I think that's a great point. And in fact, when I was preparing for this class, I came across some commonly held myths about healthcare. And maybe Steve could post that just for a minute for us to peruse it. But among the myths are mostly about what other countries are doing with their healthcare. Can you do a screen share, Steve, of that document, of that myths?
Yes, I should have that right here.
And so what this is, and I didn't come up with this list, it was a list of myths that was on a website talking about what is available in other countries. And I think these are some commonly held beliefs that Americans have about healthcare in other countries that I think prevent us from even looking at the data and the information that Dave was mentioning and seeing what it is and maybe recognize. I don't know if you remember, people were worried about death committees for the ACA, that there was going to be rationing of medicine. And you know, maybe healthcare run by our government would be wasteful by a bloated bureaucracy, but it doesn't seem to be the case in every other country that does it. Rev Mark mentioned that there was 18% of our economy is spent on healthcare. That's probably 40 to 50% higher than every other country in the industrialized country in the world that has some form of national healthcare program. And for that, for half the price or a substantial savings, they have higher longevities. They have a roughly equivalent, if not higher, ratio of nurses and doctors to per capita population. And they also have 100% coverage instead of something less than 100%. Steve,
Jeff,
also
Sonia's raised her hand for a question.
Okay, go ahead and chime in there. I was just kind of going on. Sorry.
Well,
Okay.
I just had a question relevant to the healthcare in foreign countries. I don't know, and I was wondering if any of the folks in this meeting knew. Do lobbyists for the big pharma and the healthcare, the insurance companies and the healthcare industry, do they have lobbyists to the government representatives like we do here?
Well, I'm sure large insurance has plenty of lobbies. Big pharma has lots of lobbies. And
In the other countries, in
Oh.
Germany and Canada and
well, that's,
Austria and France and
that's a good segue.
I think that it's like with the health insurance here, we have one set of health insurance, and the people in the Senate and US Congress, they have another set of
yes, but we
health
pay, yeah, and we
insurance.
pay for what they have.
And so in other countries, I think there's more of a sense of fairness and people
Maybe to answer
representing
your question, if
a
I could
common
jump in
interest.
Yeah,
again.
but my
Hold
question
on, both
is,
of you for a minute, if you don't mind. Steve,
Yeah.
could you put up the other document that I sent you? I have
Yes.
a summary of what other healthcare systems look like in other countries. There's not one model. It's not all socialized medicine. Certainly that is one model, what we would call socialized medicine. It's usually referred to as the Beveridge model that's used in Great Britain. And if you could just maybe start by looking at that first one, it's used in countries like Britain, Spain, and New Zealand, and even Cuba. And for all the problems Cuba has, I think Cubans do like their health care. They certainly has a lot of other problems, but that would be a classical socialized medicine. And to Sonia's point, that would put out of business a lot of those lobbyists, because they would, the medicine would no longer be for profit, and it would be provided for by the government. Most doctors and hospitals and nurses would be government employees. You can see some of the statistics right there. They're spending 8.7% of their GDP in these countries, or in Great Britain, on healthcare. That's half of what we're spending. And their life expectancy is 79.8 years. I think that, or 0.7 years, that's probably the same as the US. Scroll down a little bit, Steve, if you don't mind. Another model is the Bismarck model, and that's used not that far.
There we go.
Thanks. France, sure. Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Japan, Switzerland. And this is a model that I think Americans would find very familiar. It uses private insurance. It's highly around since the time Bismarck was the head of Germany around World War I. It's been around for over 100 years. They spend, again, only 11% of their GDP on healthcare, and their life expectancy in France, for example, I think the depicted flag there is 81 years. That's better than here. And I looked at other data. They have just as many nurses and doctors as we do. We won't have a shortage of nurses and doctors under these things, as many people argue. Another model, and scroll down just a little bit more, Steve, is national health insurance model like Canada, Taiwan, and South Korea. Again, 10% of their GDP as opposed to 18%. And both of these models, again, would take out a lot of the for-profit systems that would benefit from lobbyists. So I think it undermines the ability of a lobbyist to then undermine government to stack the deck the way they want it so that they make all this extra profit. It's just my interpretation of it. I would open up the floor to anyone that has other comments. Why don't you go to the final page of that, Steve, real quick. There's kind of the out-of-pocket model. A lot of Africa does that, China, India, and then the United States is kind of at the bottom. And you can see at the printing of this, it was 16% of GDP, and our life expectancy was 77.9 years. And we do have a hodgepodge of different healthcare systems within our country between Medicare, Medicaid, the VA. The VA is socialized medicine. All the VA doctors work for, and medical or military doctors, all the military get treated by employees of the federal government. It's socialized medicine in the military. I don't know if that's ironic, but why don't we go back to the big screen so I can see who else might want to chime in on this.
Jeff,
Thank
that's
you.
really,
Thank you. That's good
Whoa,
information.
Yay!
that's really helpful. Can we get a copy of that somehow, Steve?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll send it out.
I have some other data too. I will forward to Steve, and he can send a whole packet with some data. Anyone who hasn't spoke yet want to chime in first? Maybe Bob, we kind of put you on hold. Why don't you go?
Well, the argument boils down primarily to whether healthcare is a right or a privilege. And in the past, we have approached healthcare as if it were a privilege, so that for those who can afford it, we do have one of the best healthcare systems in the world. But for the general population, it is not, as you've pointed out, nearly one of the best. As a matter of fact, in infant mortality, the United States rates something around the 50 at 50 of the other countries. We do not do a good job saving our infants. And we pay twice as much money for our healthcare as any other industrialized country. And we're the only industrialized country that does not have some sort of government-funded healthcare for all people. One other point is that Medicare, as you've sort of alluded to, is not socialized medicine. The physicians that provide medicine for Medicare are not paid by the government directly. They're not on salary, at least. They are still private contractors. The last point I'd like to make is that, you know, we are so big on capitalism in this country, and our medical system is based on a capitalistic principle, but it doesn't work for medicine, because to do a capitalistic principle, you have to have supply and demand that balance each other. And there is no end to the demand, and the supply rarely keeps up with the demand, so the prices continue to rise. And that and technology in medicine are the two big pushes for the increases in our healthcare costs.
Thank you for all that. Steve?
Yeah, Jeff, could I follow up, ask a question to Bob or others? You know, 4 years ago in the presidential campaign, there was a lot of talk about healthcare programs, and some of the candidates were advocating for a dual system, side by side, having a public funded system and a private system, so that our divided country could choose between which one they wanted, and that seemed a step toward covering more people. Is that still something that people think is going to happen? Are we progressing toward that as a step in the right direction?
My opinion is probably you're right. I personally think Medicare for all is not a bad idea, but I don't think our country is ready for that yet.
That's what I think.
So we'll probably wind up with a dual system, but Medicare is a dual system. I mean, if you want really good coverage, you have to have a supplement. So we depend both on the government healthcare system for Medicare, plus our supplement, which is private healthcare, private insurance, rather. So we already have that to some degree. And yeah, I see that as a viable alternative, as long as anybody who wants to can have a public option.
That's a key aspect of Germany's system. You know, it's a right, but those who can afford it can get, if you will, the privilege side of the technology of the all private hospital systems and so on. And I think that's a key aspect, and one of the reasons that Germany is as content with its medical system as it is.
The public option.
Familiar with it, people would be more comfortable with that too if they understood what like Germany was, because it would satisfy those same needs that people are concerned about. Janet, do you want to go ahead?
The public option was actually part of the original Affordable Care Act.
Mhm.
And Obama could not get it past Congress. And if it had been originally passed, then Obamacare would have been effective because the public option would have been available for the low-income people. But he couldn't get it through, and so he had to let it drop.
Yeah.
And he controlled both houses of Congress.
Yeah.
Judith Sipad, did you want to
Yeah.
add something? Judith?
I keep hearing so many different comments here. Kind of what I'm seeing too is there are so many individuals and groups in this country that say, "Hey, I'm all for the common good, as long as it doesn't infringe on my personal rights, my lifestyle, or my finances." And I'm hearing that, and so much I'm hearing here, and I think they elect representatives with the same ideas. Yeah, as long as you don't hurt somebody's profits or something. Yeah, let's have the common good.
Could I ask Bob a question?
Go ahead.
Bob, about 3-4 years ago, there was a nurses study. In fact, there were several nurses study, but the one I caught my attention was in the Denver Post. And then I went directly to the documents, which were online at CU Health. And what jumped out at me on infant death and the mortality of the infants in the first year and the mothers, Black Americans were number one, separated completely. It was like they're in a different world. And then very recently, I read an article by a psychologist who had studied this. We don't have enough Black doctors, gynecologists that deliver the babies, the nurses who are Black. And the mortality rate goes down when you have people of color, of the same color, delivering medicine. And there's a shortage in this country. But it's something that might separate us from Germany and France and other places in the world. But I thought it was insightful. What was your experience, Bob?
Well, there have been a number of studies showing color bias in medical care.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a very real issue. And you're right, more African American doctors and nurses would help. But the infant mortality and maternal mortality rates among Blacks is primarily due to their lack of access to good prenatal care.
Is there anyone that hasn't raised their hand or made a comment yet that would like to chime in at this point? I'm going to put another question out that puts a different point on this thing. And again, it's from the book. But the book suggests that the sickest 5% of Americans consume 50% of the nation's healthcare costs, and the healthiest 50% of Americans consume only 3% of the nation's healthcare cost. What does that say to us about our system, and how might we redesign our system to promote better personal accountability, prevention, coverage, or economic efficiency? And certainly invite anyone that hasn't commented to chime in.
Well, I have commented, but I just wonder, for those people who are the sickest, would they not have been as sick if they had had access to good medical care through better insurance coverage?
I think that question answers itself. But yes, that's a great point. And
I don't know. My mother had access to very good health care, and probably a year's worth of medical care was spent on her in her last week of her life. So it isn't necessarily that it was bad health care that causes that.
I'm not saying
think
bad
we-
health care. I'm saying lack of health care. People that are sick, but they do not seek medical treatment because they can't afford it and have
Right.
no insurance.
Yeah, you would think logically that if people that don't have health care had basic needs met, that they might not suffer catastrophic events as often or as frequently as they might otherwise. But I think to Charlotte's point, and I wonder how we all feel about this, that a lot of Americans in the last year or weeks or short period of time of their life, we spend vast amounts of money on heroic efforts to keep people alive for the last few weeks, or an extra, in Millie Snow's case, maybe a month more of life that wasn't of very good quality, but cost probably as much as the health care she had received for the year or two before that. What do people think about that? Is that something we should have a frank and honest conversation about when we redesign healthcare? It's a tough question. Panay, you need to unmute. Unmute yourself. It's in the lower left-hand corner.
It's true, but when my experience has been that when you discuss that issue with the patient's family, and usually you're at that stage, the patient is not really able to make that decision for themselves.
True.
You discuss it with the family is not willing to let go. And individual patients are not willing to let go either. So we all fear death for some strange reason. If we're Christians, we really shouldn't fear death. When you think
we found really that we did not get advised about other options besides treatment, and more treatment, and maybe some more treatment after that. Panay wanted to chime in on this. Go ahead. You've unmuted yourself.
Just that I have had that same experience with parents and in-laws. And oh my gosh, yes, it's something we have to talk about. And you have to talk about it before it happens. And so you know what to do and how to handle it. It was just hard.
And I think to Bob's point, yeah, it is. It's impossible that people in that situation having to answer that question for the very first time are going to make an economic or rational decision. You're going to act emotionally and from your gut.
Yep.
Laura, you're muted right now. There, great.
Thank you. Hi. I think I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm thinking about, Panay just said we have to talk about it earlier, and I think we could even go and talk about it earlier than that. If we think about some of the ways, and Mark mentioned this in the book as well, we place fast food restaurants in certain neighborhoods, or access to grocery stores. The cheaper food is the processed food that is probably not as good for you or as healthy for you. And I think we sort of end up setting up certain people, groups, whoever, in our communities, maybe knowing it, maybe not knowing it. And that causes a lot of ripple effect. And I think if we don't have good healthcare coverage or don't have trust in the healthcare system, maybe some of those smaller headaches or sore throats or whatever, we don't go get those treated, or we don't feel like we have anyone, we can't afford to get those treated. And then later on down the line, could become those life-altering medical scenarios that none of us want to be in. And so I think that there's a lot further back we can go, while at the same time, honoring and recognizing. I love that first axiom of the glory of God as a human being fully alive. Like, if I'm the image of God, if you're the image of God, my job is to discover that image within myself and set it free. My job is to recognize that image in you. And if we can do that a little bit better, then maybe we will help even this out a little bit. So I think that it is even bigger than we already know that it is. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about and wrestling with.
Extremely well said. I appreciate how you tied that issue right back to the axiom and some of the other comments that we've made. But it also reminded me of what the insurance salesman that we buy some of our family insurance from always reminds me that women make much more health insurance claims than men, but guess who lives longer?
I need to talk about that as far as the quality of life. We did have an early conversation with my mother, partly because of my sister's situation. My mother did make her decisions. And when it came to her end of life, the family was on board with her decisions. And we told the medical professionals what her decisions were. And we had to fight tooth and nail to get the medical professionals to let us go ahead and follow what my mother wanted, because they didn't want to do that. They wanted to do all the extra interventions and so forth. And she wanted quality of life up until her death.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Judy.
I think when Sonia said fully alive, that's something that really resonated with me just now. My mother with Alzheimer's for several years, and at the point when the call came to us saying, can we take her to the hospital? I think her blood pressure is dropping. It's the call that came from her assisted living quarters. And we said, what will they do there? And they said, well, they might be able to stabilize her blood pressure. And I said, I think she's very comfortable Christian. She's ready. She has expressed over and over that the quality of life was not there. And as we saw it just disintegrate, she didn't want the blood pressure to go back to a normal thing. She was ready to go. And again, because we said, no, don't take her to the hospital, just leave her where she is. It was a very smooth, easy transition, I think, for all of us. And when you think of how much cost would have been involved in that, that was not an issue that we were thinking. But now that I'm thinking about it, it's like, oh my gosh, it could have been a lot.
Mm-hmm. I want to amplify what Laura said. Jeff?
Please go ahead.
I toured the Cuba exhibit when it was here in before COVID last year, and then the IMAX experience. Cuba has the most beautiful natural reefs, coral reefs in the world, and they dated that to 1992. And that's the year in which Cuba was forced to stop using fertilizer and go back to organic farming. And they brought all the old farmers out of retirement. And the old farmers taught the new farmers how not to use chemicals. And then our University of Miami in Florida came out with a study just months ago that it's the nitrogen in the marine water, the excess nitrogen, that's causing the coral reefs to die. So if our eyes would only open, there are so many ways that we could make food accessible to people who don't have access now, and we could get the processed food off of the commercials, just the way we did liquor and tobacco. People would buy what's healthy. You put in the temple what
Completely.
belongs in the temple and not poison. Okay.
The world and our healthcare and our bodies, we have to be viewing all of this as one system that we're a part of. It's, not only is the earth a giant ecosystem that we depend on for us, but you know, our economy is like an ecosystem, really, more than it is, you know, competitive thing. It's cooperation is really what makes success. Given that the time it is, and I think haven't seen anybody raise their hand recently, I'd like to go ahead and wrap it up with the prayer. If you want to follow along, great discussion. I want to thank everyone for chiming in, and I will make sure that Steve has a little bit more information to email around. But I wanted to draw your attention when you get the handout that has the country flags on it and a description of the different systems of healthcare systems. Down at the bottom is a reference to a book by T.R. Reid called The Healing of America. And I read that book when the ACA was being passed. And it's an excellent read. But the author needed to have some shoulder surgery. So he pretended, or was as a journalist, went to all these different countries and accessed their healthcare as to how they would treat his rotator cuff surgery need. And he went to India, he went to Great Britain, he went to France and Japan, and he outlines in great detail all the different nuances of those different systems. I thought it was very interesting. Steve?
Jeff, just a related comment. T.R. Reid lives in Denver, and we at St. Andrew had invited him to come speak to us this last spring, but then COVID hit and we had to cancel. But he is going to come back, and we're going to have a good presentation in the church when we get back in there. So
I should have known you were already on that.
yeah.
Let's assume a posture of prayer and thank God for this time and opportunity that we have to share our perspectives and learning in this book. Lord, open our eyes that we may see you in our brothers and sisters. Lord, open our ears that we may hear the cries of the hungry, the cold, the frightened, the oppressed. Lord, open our hearts that we may love each other as you love us. Renew in us your spirit. Lord, free us and make us one. Amen.
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 Thank you, Jeff. Good discussion.
Thank you. It was a great discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff, and